Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, May 24th. And tonight, the cleanup continues across Ontario and Quebec after a storm on Saturday that killed 10 people. Hydro-Quebec reports 76% of customers who lost power are back on the grid, and that at the peak, about 550,000 homes were in the dark from Gatineau to Quebec City. Restoring the remaining outages in Quebec and in parts of Ontario could take days. Ontario's Hydro One reports crews are rebuilding 3 transmission towers and dealing with more than 1,400 broken poles and nearly 200 damaged transformers. Meanwhile, Defense Minister Anita Anand has announced up to $98 million in new military aid for Ukraine. She says the government has bought more than 20,000 rounds of 155mm artillery. These rounds are compatible with guns that Canada and its allies have already provided to Kyiv. Minister Anand says Canada has supplied Ukraine with heavy artillery guns, small arms, specialized equipment, and armored vehicles. A tragic anniversary yesterday. It was 1 year ago that the Ticumlup-Secwepemc First Nation announced unmarked graves were discovered at the site of a former residential school in BC. The grave sites in Kamloops are believed to contain the remains of hundreds of children. A day-long ceremony marking Monday's anniversary included prayers, drumming, and speeches. This included one from Governor General Mary Simon, who said no child deserved to be treated so cruelly. Chief Roseanne Casimir opened the memorial, saying she hopes the events over the past year will lead to reconciliation for Indigenous peoples. All right, well, in Ontario, the main political parties are trumpeting their climate change plans on the campaign trail. This comes after a deadly storm ripped across the province over the weekend. Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford, who is seeking to hold on to the Premier's office, says the province is investing in electric vehicles and electric arc furnaces as part of his plan to fight climate change. Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca says his party has earmarked some $300 million for a climate resilience plan for municipalities and conservation authorities. NDP leader Andrea Horwath says her party would fix the disaster relief program to get money to affected residents quicker, and they plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a net zero by 2050. Green leader Mike Schreiner has touted a long list of environmental initiatives, including halving climate pollution by 2030. In Canada's north, a lack of housing is causing problems, even for those trying to build more homes. Many companies rely on workers who fly in, and finding housing for them is difficult and expensive. Daniel Gadbois is working 10 or 12-hour days as an electrician in Kuujjuaq in northern Quebec just to try to keep up with the work. He says companies like his need more support, and the North needs more funding to close the gap. The federal government says it has made record spending promises on northern and Indigenous housing. Indigenous Affairs Minister Mark Miller says it's absolutely not enough and that change will take time. Meanwhile, a new study is highlighting the importance of the proposed Atlantic Loop for helping Atlantic Canada reach net zero carbon emissions. But it stresses that the electrification project alone isn't enough. At an estimated $5 billion, the proposed energy corridor would connect the 4 Atlantic provinces to hydroelectricity from Quebec and Labrador. The study was done for the Halifax-based Ecology Action Centre, and it says once coal is phased out, the demand for electricity will likely increase. The study's modeling suggests that the Atlantic Loop is important in meeting future demand, but it must be combined with increased energy from renewable sources along with energy efficiency initiatives. All right, turning to another study now, where researchers say it appears that the longer a person is exposed to pollution, the worse a COVID-19 infection hits them. An extensive study of thousands of COVID-19 patients in Ontario hospitals has been published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Chen Chen, an epidemiologist at the University of California, says the research shows that more severe reactions to the virus were associated with higher levels of long-term exposure to smog. She says it adds to the growing body of evidence that air pollution is what she calls a silent killer. Well, it looks like the start of the CFL preseason is once again in doubt. This comes after players voted against ratifying the tentative deal reached last Wednesday between the league and CFL Players Association. The two sides had reached this tentative 7-year agreement 4 days after players with 7 of the league's 9 teams went on strike. At issue is contract language surrounding the league's Canadian player ratio. Stay with us. We'll be right back shortly. A national substance use research organization is warning about a new type of opioid that is increasingly being found in Canada's unregulated drug supply. The Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction says there is a rising presence of potent synthetic opioids called nitazines in the country's drug supply. The rise coincides with an increase in prevalence of benzodiazepines, which are often used as sedatives and tranquilizers. Meanwhile, advocates are sounding the alarm on Canada's toxic drug supply as more and more people die due to preventable poisoning from unregulated drugs. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into what is being called a poisoning crisis is Donald MacPherson, the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Now, it's clear that the unregulated drug supply in Canada is becoming more diverse. So how has this expanding supply impacted preventable deaths in the country?
Well, first of all, the supply is unregulated. So it's manufactured around the world in various laboratories and transported to different regions. So there's no quality control, there's no distribution control. So it's something that's been going on for many, many years now, and we know that an unregulated drug market is becoming more toxic, and it's taking more lives than ever before.
And we have seen a rise in drug use during the pandemic, but this isn't a really new problem for Canada. How has the opioid crisis been impacting Canadians even before the pandemic?
The major change in the illegal drug market took place in the early teens, 2012, 13, 14, when highly concentrated fentanyl began to appear in the illegal and unregulated drug market. And that fentanyl just increased in the number of people who were dying from fentanyl poisoning increased, and to the point where we're setting new records every month, every year. 80 to 90% of people who've died from overdose or drug toxicity have had fentanyl in their systems. So it's an absolute unmitigated catastrophic failure of our public policy, and is something desperately needs to be changed.
It's really hard to hear those numbers. Now, why is the supply so toxic? What are the reasons behind these drug poisoning deaths in Canada within this illicit supply?
It's the nature of an unregulated illegal market. Unregulated illegal markets tend to favor the importation and creation of highly toxic substances, highly concentrated substances, which are easier to transport, easier to smuggle, and then get mixed in various regions of the country. But the fentanyl molecules are so powerful, it's almost impossible to mix them outside of a laboratory. And it's a change in business model for the transnational organized crime groups that control drugs around the world. And it's not going to end. It's not going to end until we do something fairly common sense like take these drugs away from those organized transnational criminals and create a regulated supply of drugs that people can have access to.
Just about a minute left here, Mr. MacPherson, but tell us a little bit more about this. This is called a preventable issue for a reason. So what steps need to be done to take care of this toxic drug supply in Canada?
Well, in the crisis that we're experiencing right now, we need to scale up safer places for people to use these substances so that they have ready access to drug testing, to naloxone, which reverses overdoses, um, and not places where you're not using alone. In the longer term, we need to move towards a much safer supply of substances. People are going to continue using substances. So we need to acknowledge the danger that exists in the market right now and move towards accessing a safer supply up until a legal regulated supply. That's the main intervention that will get rid of the toxic drug market.
All right, Mr. MacPherson, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be taking a look at a new study on sudden infant death syndrome. We'll be speaking to Dr. Wendy Potter, chair of the board of directors at Baby's Breath Canada. Stay tuned. We'll be right back shortly. New research out of Australia may help identify an indicator for sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS. The recent study from the Children's Hospital at Westmead in Australia has discovered a potential biomarker for SIDS. While it has been touted as a medical breakthrough since its publication, this study only represents an incremental advance towards finding a possible cause for this condition. Baby's Breath Canada, a national organization focused on SIDS, estimates that 3 infants die of SIDS every single week in Canada. In addition, infants of an Indigenous background are at even greater risk of SIDS. Well, joining us today to discuss this condition is Dr. Wendy Potter, chair of the board at Baby's Breath Canada. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
My pleasure. It's awesome to be able to talk about this with you and to get some of the messaging out.
We appreciate you joining us, ma'am. Now, can you explain to our viewers about this potential biomarker for SIDS that was discovered in this study?
Yes. So first, I guess a little background. Biomarkers are naturally occurring genes or characters or substances that are associated with certain functions or conditions, and they're measurable. And butyrylcholinesterase is a protein or an enzyme that works and is involved in the autonomic nervous system. This is a system that helps regulate different things in your body, like your heart rate and your breathing, when you are completely unaware that it's working sort of in the background, I guess. And the researchers in this study feel that butyrylcholinesterase might be a biomarker to help identify babies who may have an increased risk of dying of sudden infant death syndrome. That a deficit of this enzyme would alter the autonomic nervous system and its ability to influence the way babies are breathing, and perhaps the baby wouldn't arouse as it normally would.
Now, this is being touted as a huge development in this research, but what does this mean for potential treatments or screenings for the future of SIDS?
This study is a very interesting and solid contribution to SIDS research. It's, however, small, very preliminary, and definitely further research needs to be encouraged so that we can understand the significance. At this point, SIDS is considered an umbrella diagnosis, and it is not considered to be one cause fits all. However, importantly, this study brings again up important questions of arousal issues, and also the work other researchers are doing on biomarkers, different biomarkers. Serotonin is one of those, and people have been working on these things for decades, actually. Progress seems to be slow, but still some work has to be done before we can understand how specifically it can identify risk. We use screening tests to identify issues or abnormalities, but they're only good if we are able then to intervene and change and make improvements such that the life of a baby would be improved. We're far from this with the new and exciting research. And the other issue is you don't want to alarm parents. There are errors that can occur, inaccuracies. And so, although I wouldn't call it a breakthrough, it's definitely a very welcome contribution, and enormous interest has been generated, which is just fantastic.
Just about a minute left here, Dr. Potter, but what information should every parent know when it comes to SIDS?
Probably the most important thing, SIDS is probably multifactorial. You cannot predict it, you can't prevent it, and it is not the same as suffocation or accidental asphyxia. You can reduce the risk by following safe sleep guidelines, and that you can find those on the Joint Statement of Public Health of Canada, PHAC, and you can find that in multiple videos on our website, Baby's Breath. It is probably related to a genetic or biological vulnerability, and research in that area really should be encouraged.
Dr. Wendy Potter from Baby's Breath Canada, thank you again for your time today and sharing this with us.
Thank you so much.
Stay with us. Up next, we've got more news from around the world. Ukraine accuses Russia of trying to inflict as much death and destruction as possible. A new poll suggests Americans are becoming less supportive for using sanctions to punish Russia. And food banks and community food hubs across the UK are seeing soaring demand amid deep financial hardships. We'll have these stories and more coming up after the break, so stay tuned. We'll be back here shortly on Forum Daily News. Stay with us. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is accusing the Russians of waging total war on his country and trying to inflict as much death and destruction as possible. Workers digging through the rubble of an apartment building in Mariupol found 200 decomposing bodies in the basement. The port city that is now in Russian hands has seen some of the worst suffering of the 3-month-old war. An estimated 100,000 people remain out of a pre-war population of 450,000. And officials report many are trapped without food, water, heat, or electricity. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the war in Ukraine is providing proof that doing business with authoritarian regimes in Russia or China poses risks for Western security. He told the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, that free trade has brought a lot of prosperity and wealth, but that it comes with a price. Mr. Stoltenberg warned against countries relying too heavily on commodities or advanced technologies, or by allowing foreign control over national infrastructure like 5G networks. All of this comes as a new poll is suggesting Americans are becoming less supportive of punishing Russia for its invasion of Ukraine if the sanctions affect the U.S. economy. The poll from the Associated Press Nork Center for Public Affairs Research finds 45% of adults say America's bigger priority should be sanctioning Russia as effectively as possible. This while 51% say it should be limiting damage to the U.S. economy. Now that's a flip of the numbers from a similar poll done last month. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is accusing Russia of deliberately bombarding grain warehouses across Ukraine and of hoarding its own food exports to increase global prices. The European Union says Ukraine accounted for 90% of grain and oilseed exports before the war. Ms. von der Leyen told the World Economic Forum in Davos that about 20 million tons of wheat are currently stuck in Ukraine. She says bread prices in Lebanon are up 70%, and food shipments from Odessa have been blocked from reaching Somalia. Meanwhile, across the United Kingdom, food banks and community food hubs that helped struggling families, older people, and the homeless during the pandemic are now seeing soaring demand. Skyrocketing energy and food bills are pushing millions deeper into financial hardship, and increasing numbers cannot afford to buy groceries. The cost of food and fuel in the UK has risen sharply since late last year, with inflation reaching the highest level in 40 years. In April, millions of families saw their annual energy bill jump by 54%, and another energy price hike is expected in October. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus fought back tears as he was confirmed by the World Health Organization's member countries for a second 5-year term. No one ran against him. Critics say Mr. Tedros has had some mishaps, but has also been a steady voice throughout the pandemic, railing against rich countries for hoarding vaccines and insisting that drug companies aren't doing enough to make their medicines available to the poor. Moving to Rwanda now, where the military has accused neighboring Congolese forces of injuring several civilians in cross-border shelling. Rwanda has asked that the expanded joint verification mechanism urgently investigate that shelling that Rwanda says took place on Monday morning. Some Congolese authorities have accused Rwandan forces of supporting armed groups in mineral-rich eastern Congo. This is where dozens of such groups are active. Rwanda has described allegations of supporting rebels in Congo as baseless. Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, says it will start publicly providing more details about how advertisers target people with political ads. It is acting just months before the U.S. midterm elections. The company has faced criticism for years over withholding too much information on targeted advertising. Meta will start showing the demographics and interests of audiences that advertisers select to target with political ads on platforms like Facebook and Instagram. The company will also share how much advertisers spent in an effort to target people in certain states. Manitoba Premier Heather Stefanson has thanked more than 300 Ukrainians for choosing the province as their home away from home. The group arrived from Poland on a federally chartered flight to Manitoba's capital city yesterday afternoon. Aksenia Zinenko arrived with 8 other relatives, and she says it was hard for her family to leave their homeland. But they felt they had no other choice but to flee Russia's invasion. Other flights are due to arrive in the coming weeks. All right, take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.